All right, well, it's my great pleasure and privilege to introduce my good friend, Jonathan Thorndike. We got to know each other for 3 years. I was on the faculty at Aquinas College in Nashville, Tennessee. And while I was there, Jonathan started to come to one or two things I was organizing for the Center for Faith and Culture at Aquinas College. And then he invited me, living recklessly, to give some guest teach one or two of his classes. Shakespeare was one, I think. Tolkien was another. I can't really remember now. Yeah. So we became good friends. So over a period of 3 years, we got to know each other quite well. Had the pleasure of staying at your home once and getting to know your wife. So also, actually, you have family members living in this area now as well. But Jonathan is a fine scholar, a fine professor of literature and director of the Honors College at Belmont University in Nashville, Tennessee. He is also a great C.S. Lewis scholar, and he's written for my magazine, the St. Austin Review. Now, when you're making an introduction, it doesn't mean you can't have a commercial break in it. So, I obviously edited a magazine called the St. Austin Review. Check it out in there. But Jonathan's written for us in the past, and I'm sitting on at least one of your articles as we speak, which I'll be publishing soon. So, it's just a real privilege and a pleasure to have a scholar of Jonathan Thorndike's caliber to speak to us, and also a personal pleasure to see you again. So without further ado, I'll introduce you to my friend and colleague, Jonathan Thorndike.
Well, thank you so much, Joseph, and I'm so happy to be here at the Rochester Chesterton Conference. And just a little bit of background. You can see my topic up here is Chesterton, Chaucer, and the Canterbury Tales. And I have sort of a moving tableau that I won't leave it up, for much longer because I might mesmerize you, or I might sort of put you to sleep, and don't want that to happen, because I am the person who's speaking before lunch and realize that, once we get to the point of I want you to continue to fellowship with each other and to have lunch. And so I do have my eye on a clock back there, and I have some pictures to show you, and I'll move past this tableau. But I was telling Lou that in preparation for this event, I did want to sit down and write out my thoughts, and so I wrote a 20-page paper. So I was saying, well, what happens if I would read a 20-page paper right before lunch? Probably not a great idea, but I do want to quote some excerpts from Chesterton's study of Chaucer, and just to link Chaucer to this grand tradition of Christian poetry. And as Ted so well stated, I think, in quoting C.S. Lewis, when you look at just the embarrassment of riches, I guess you could say, or the grand tradition going all the way back through the Middle Ages and, back to the Psalms. So we do have like an organizational scheme in mind. If Ted was talking about the Psalms, I'm talking about the Middle Ages with Chaucer and well into the Christian tradition. And then after lunch, Joseph Pearce will be talking about the whole span of Christian poetry and reading excerpts from great Christian poems over time, and then ending with Mr. Dale Ahlquist kind of putting a cap on the whole thing. So it does have this sort of chronological organization that does make a lot of sense. But obviously my topic is Chaucer and Chesterton's book on Chaucer, which I have back here, which I've been studying for the past few months. But I need to also sort of take a step back and say, why Chaucer and why Chesterton's book? Well, for obvious reasons. And then my entry point really is C.S. Lewis. When in the 90s I was teaching at a liberal arts college in Wisconsin, I was teaching a course on, initially it was just C.S. Lewis. This was Lakeland College in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. I taught a course on C.S. Lewis because I happen to love all of his writing and have read all of his books and thought this would be a great idea. At that time we had a January term. The students would take just one course in January, so we could spend just the whole month of January. It was just on C.S. Lewis. And then realizing that, we've got the Wade Center, the Marion Wade Center in Wheaton, Illinois, a Chicago suburb that was, at the time, Christopher Mitchell, since has passed, was the director of the Wade Center at Wheaton College, and they have the original wardrobe that back in the day, was purchased from the house in Oxford where C.S. Lewis lived. The wardrobe, as in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, is in the Chicago suburbs at Wheaton College. If you would ever happen to be in that area, it's worth your time to visit because they've got manuscripts and they've got the wardrobe and they have the desk supposedly that was used by T.S. Eliot, I believe, and all kinds of paraphernalia. It's a beautiful place, the Wade Center. So I took my students to the Wade Center. One thing led to another, and then as I would teach that course about every other year, I started to add Tolkien, J.R.R. Tolkien, of course, as a member of the Inklings. And right in the early 2000s, when the Peter Jackson films were coming out, and there was huge interest in Tolkien as a novelist, as a writer of Christian fiction, really. And then one thing led to another. I started teaching the course overseas in our summer school program. We had a consortium arrangement where we could teach a course for 5 weeks in London at King's College London. So at that point, started to branch out a little bit farther and read more books by other members of the Inklings. And at that time, we were located in Hampstead in North London. King's College had a campus, satellite campus there. So we started to read novels by Charles Williams and novels by Dorothy L. Sayers, all Christian writers living in the early 20th century, 30s, 40s. And then you can see where this is all headed, going back toward G.K. Chesterton as a common influence and a member of the Detection Club in late 19th century. And Dorothy L. Sayers kind of inheriting that tradition. If anyone has ever read Gaudy Night or Strong Poison, I think is the novel I used in that particular class. But so the circle gets bigger, or the tradition gets larger when you start looking at Christian poetry, Christian literature, the Inklings. It begins with C.S. Lewis for me, and then just kind of continues to add, and find that over time the interest gets stronger. I think that, as Ted expressed so well, when was it that poetry became sort of captured by the Academy and become kind of a special interest and not the language of the people or the language of the common man? And so through studying the Inklings, I think it's one way to kind of get back to that in that poetry and literature written by Christians, talking to other Christians, and being very interesting to other people. Anyways, so that's that. So I have a question for you. This is on Chaucer now in Chesterton. And what did Chesterton say about Chaucer, and how does Chaucer relate to this great tradition? So can you raise your hand if in high school or in college, how many of you had to read The Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer? So I thought there would be quite a few, because my students, you probably remember, what they experienced. So keep your hand up. Did you have to read Chaucer in Middle English, untranslated? So a few more. Okay, and then one more question. Raise your hand if you had to memorize the beginning of the Canterbury Tales in Middle English. Did anybody have to memorize it? So,
I would say I didn't have to memorize it, but for our project we had to write our own Chaucerian style poem.
Oh wow, okay.
Yeah, and I did that senior year. It was a lot of fun.
You did senior year in high school? In high school.
Yeah.
And I thought if someone had memorized it, sometimes I'm talking to my students at Belmont in Nashville, they still can recite it from memory, the first 10 or 15 lines or so. And I'll give them extra credit, actually, if they recite it. I mean, you've got it up there in Middle English. I don't know if you could recite. Do you remember, could you recite any of it?
The one I wrote? Yeah. It starts off as, there once was a bellboy of 10 and 9, who lived a fruitful life and did so fine, his belaboring duties with largest celerity, and put forth his efforts with keen sincerity.
Oh wow, thank you. That's wonderful. And it just reminds us, I think, about kind of the origin of poetry and where it came from in connection to the scriptures and connection to a writer like Chaucer.
And the inspiration for it came from my first girlfriend dumping me.
And C.S. Lewis said this in his writing too, like how often is it that when Lewis, some of you might have read Surprised by Joy, that is C.S. Lewis kind of spiritual autobiography about his early years in conversion to Christianity. And at one point he really says, as I am beginning in this journey to understand God through Christ and reading the scriptures and reading the poetry, it just so happens that all of the good writers happen to be Christians. Why is that? This is when he was like a theist before he's actually going through his conversion experience. Why is it that all the good writers happen to be Christians? And of course then Lewis goes on to become a professor of medieval and Renaissance literature and write some of the best-selling, best-known books to this day in Christian commentary, and the Space Trilogy, the Chronicles, all that good stuff. But so there's something to that, and the fact that in this tradition you do have like structure and verse and meter and rhyme, and so when I dare my students to recite, it happens to be the Odyssey this semester, to studying Homer's Odyssey, and they get extra credit if they can recite 14 to 20 lines from memory from Homer's Odyssey. So I won't ask you all that, but it just, you can do that one too. But that's where poetry goes back to where it came from. If you ever get a chance of just, I'm going to memorize this, opening to the Canterbury Tales, or I'm going to memorize a good sonnet by T.S. Eliot, or I'm going to memorize a poem by Wordsworth, or anything in that tradition. If you happen to see Joseph's book that he'll be talking about, great collection of Christian poetry there, you can, just as a sort of mental challenge to yourself, memorize a really good Christian poem, and then you can pull it out at a dinner party or when you're with your family or friends and just kind of recite from memory, and it kind of is taken aback. And so anyways, this is my entry to British literature, I guess, and to Christian literature when I was assigned to read the prologue and a few of the Canterbury Tales in high school, not this version of it, but and translated into modern English. And I think it was Neville Coghill who did a modernized version of the Canterbury Tales. It was published in the 60s, I want to say. That's the one that we read in high school, and then in college, reading it again with a real professor of Middle English who said, okay, now we're going to read it in the Middle English with Troilus and Cressida and the Parliament of Fowls and other things written by Chaucer. But so from my memory of the 70s, I guess I would say, Wan dat April with the sure soot, the drought of March hath pursed to the rota, and bought in every vein and switched liqueur, of which virtue engendered is the fluor. Wan Zephyrus eke, with his swayed breath, inspired hath in every holt and hath the tender corpse and the young son, hath in around his half course he run, and small fowls maken melody that slepen all the nicht with open ye, so pricked him nature and here courageous, dan longen folk to go on pilgrimages. Of Engelman to Canterbury they wende, the holy blissful martyr for to sake, of sundry folk by aventure y falla, in fellowship and pilgrims were they alla, toward Canterbury, Walton, Reda. And so, it's probably a butchered version of the Middle English, but from my great professor in college who had us learn, the Middle English and read it that way. You can tell, you can recognize about every third or fourth word, but not instantaneously. Really, sort of, you have to have the modern translation beside it. But then once you do it for a few weeks, just probably like reading Greek or Hebrew or something, you kind of internalize it. So a person could sit down with nothing but the Middle English Chaucer and work it out slowly and painfully, so that it is still the English language, and it is remarkable that Chaucer wrote in English instead of in French or Latin. So I'll do a little bit of the background of Chaucer and talk about some of the great stories in the Canterbury Tales. But our topic is really Chesterton, and why did he write on Chaucer? And I guess you could say, well, he wrote about everything, and so it was only a matter of time if Chaucer was going to land on, if Chesterton was going to land on Chaucer, because he was so prolific and so fun and entertaining and enlightening to read. And so I would recommend to you that book if you ever want to probably read the Canterbury Tales first and then read Chesterton's book on Chaucer. So how is it the author of the Father Brown detective stories is also known as a first-rate scholar of a medieval poet? And so his book is published in 1932 by Faber and Faber in the UK. And here's another influence or another source that explains my interest in Chaucer and in Chesterton is a man that you all are familiar with called Hilaire Belloc. And a picture of Hilaire Belloc and the book by Hilaire Belloc called The Old Road, in which he's trying to reconstruct the actual physical path that Chaucer's pilgrims followed from Winchester to Canterbury. And this is another really good book that I'd recommend because Belloc walked this path in December in 7 days, and he probably had to cover 20 or 30 miles a day to go that distance. It's 120 miles from Winchester to Canterbury, and I'm going to be doing this myself in the spring on sabbatical because I've always been interested in religious pilgrimage, and the life of the Middle Ages is portrayed in such a clear and interesting and vibrant way in the Canterbury Tales. I kind of thought, what better idea than to go to Winchester and walk to Canterbury in the month that Chaucer recommends, that I just showed you in April, on an April. So my wife will be joining me a little bit later, but my plan is first to go to Oxford and stay in the house of C.S. Lewis and read a little bit more about the country walks that C.S. Lewis did, and then to make my way to Winchester. And I'll explain that, how this figures into Chaucer and to Chesterton's book. This photo, all of these photos are public domain, older kind of historical photos, a black and white photo. I like this photo a lot because it says something about the personality, I think, of Belloc and Chesterton. But those of you who have my, you can sort of, the body language and the sort of kind of relationship they had. Those of you who have seen this photo before in a book or on the internet might know that I cropped out a third person. There was another person, and I was going to ask, who was the person that I took out of the photo? Does anybody know who would be here?
Shaw.
Exactly, it's G.B. Shaw, George Bernard Shaw. And why is that significant? It was another... Sorry?
They had debates.
They debated all the time. They did not agree with each other on the most fundamental matters of life and art and faith and society. So just the fact that they were friends, they were still, in a communal relationship of some kind. They talked to each other, they argued with each other. C.S. Lewis is famous for, loving debate and loving to be an expert. But I cut out G.B. Shaw because it's not about him. But they were friends. They were friends, and so we like to keep that in mind in the context of Christian, grace and generosity and fellowship. Here is a statue of Chaucer as Pilgrim. It was only put up, 4 or 5 years ago, 2016. This I think is interesting, and it's in the sort of the town square, the village square in Canterbury. In the background of this photo, it says Cornwall Food Company. They sell these pasties, that sort of meat pies that are really good. So anyone that looks at that statue gets hungry because it says, I've got to go get one of those Cornish pasties that's like a meat pie. But the point of it is that Chaucer is portrayed as a pilgrim, and he is making his way from Winchester to Canterbury. Actually not Winchester, but in the Canterbury Tales. Where does the Canterbury Tale start? It says right up there, at the Tavern Inn in Southwark, sort of south of the Thames. There's a Southwark Cathedral, some of you might have visited. And so that's a shorter path. And then if you remember the Canterbury Tales, it's really not about the path per se. It's really more about the fact that 30 people are gathering in a pub and telling stories with each other because they're all going to Canterbury. Some of them are going for religious reasons. Some of them are pious and, devoted Christians, and they really want to do it. But a lot of them are just going on a trip because it's the Middle Ages, and most people never travel more than 50 miles from the place they were born. And the idea of going that distance from London, in this case, to Canterbury to go to to see the cathedral and to pay homage to St. Thomas of Becket, well, you might have some fun along the way. You might be able to tell some stories. You might meet some other people. They're not all going there for religious reasons. And this is what is portrayed in Canterbury Tales. And this statue, raise your hand. Has anyone been to Canterbury, the Canterbury Cathedral? Did you see this statue when you were there?
No.
I didn't see it the last time I was there too, because I've been there since 2016, about every other year. So I know I was there in 17 and 19. Didn't go last summer because the pandemic disrupted everything. I'll be going next summer, so I didn't see it in person, but I know exactly where it is. And in the statue, he's holding the beginning of the Canterbury Tales, which we just read, on vellum or deer skin, and he's got an astrolabe around his neck, like a medieval sort of celestial navigation tool that you can use an astrolabe to find your way according to position of the stars. So he looks very sort of devout and sort of serious in intent, and that's not the case of the stories themselves. Here's the modern day map of the Pilgrim's Way from either the Tabard Inn in Suffolk or from Winchester, which is the route that I will be walking based on research by Hilaire Belloc in this book. The difference is that in the 21st century, we have creature comforts and we have villages to stop and B&Bs and pubs and taverns, and there's even a company that my wife and I are going to take advantage of this company that will transport your luggage from village to village. So unlike a real pilgrim who's walking entirely on his or her own, self-supplied, this one is like I think I've got the next slide to show you. Here's just a picture of what it looks like. It looks fairly pleasant, and you're walking through greenery and trees, and it's the South Downs Way. You're going from Hampshire through Sussex and into Kent, known as the sort of breadbasket or the Garden of England in southeast England. It doesn't look like that all the way. Sometimes you actually do have to walk along busy motorways or busy roadways. But this is the route that we'll be doing in 14 or 15 days with the names of the villages, and so you can see how it's broken up. So, suffice it to say that I'm following in the spirit of Chaucer and Chesterton, but it's going to be not as arduous as it was in the Middle Ages, because we're only going 9 miles on the first day, 12 miles on the second day to Alton, 11 miles on the third day. And we also have that ability to take a day off and just stay in the village. And if it's raining, it rains a lot in England, so we might be able to do that. So obviously this is our destination, and would recommend anyone ever having the ability to go to Canterbury, and talking a little bit about why is Canterbury in southeast England and not someplace else. And on that earlier map where I had Winchester on this side and Canterbury on this side, Belloc in his book I think does a really good job of kind of explaining from the point of view of history and geography and sort of the lay of the land. If you just looked at the map, you would say that if you wanted to go from east to west in the opposite direction, what the original idea that settlement and migration happened from Europe, from the continent, from France to the United Kingdom or to the island of Britain. And it's not that England was unoccupied. England has all of these native groups, the Angles, and there's eventually the Saxon invasion, the Jutes and the Frisians and the Germanic people are all sort of mixed together, and then St. Augustine bringing Christianity in the 5th century, 497, I think. So what is it like before then? If you have this migration from the continent to England, Belloc in The Old Road says, well, they probably wanted to, if they landed roughly in the vicinity of Dover, where the port is, they would want to go from east to west, because in the west is where you find the big oak trees, and you'd be walking along a river valley, and you would find the metals in the ground, like the copper and the tin and the basic raw materials that you could work would be found more in the west. And so by natural lay of the land, the fact you're walking along the chalk ridge, if those of you who've been there to see, remember the white cliffs of Dover, the chalk that sort of continues all the way, and it doesn't go all the way to Winchester, but just looking at the geography, I think Belloc is really good at explaining a person who's in southeast England would naturally want to go in that direction because that's where everything is and that's where the valley goes and walking along the chalk ridge. And then what reversed the direction, like this takes us to Chesterton and Chaucer. At some point, Winchester becomes the sort of seat of the government, or in the time before England is really solidified in national identity. The king is in Winchester, another big cathedral, and a lot of historical importance in Winchester. So you've got the king in Winchester before London gets economically developed and London becomes kind of the superpower city where everything is in London. Not yet. I mean, London is there, but Winchester is really more important, and Canterbury is really more important. So the question is, if people were coming from France and they were landing roughly around Dover, Belloc works out that Canterbury is a logical place where the 5 ports would converge. You would go to Canterbury because it's about equidistant from all the ports in southeast England. Like that's the place where St. Augustine would bring the beginning of the Christian Church, 597 CE, and it's rebuilt. This is what it looks like in today's terms. Although it does have scaffolding. There's always scaffolding up where they're refurbishing and making it better and going inside the cathedral. But so here's another question for you. So what event causes people to want to go to Canterbury Cathedral right at this time in the Middle Ages? Because most of the time, they're probably going back and forth both ways. Initially, they're going to the west, but now they're going from west to east. They're going from Winchester to Canterbury. So what causes them to want to go? Why would you want to go on pilgrimage to Canterbury Cathedral today, like I am, or in the Middle Ages? Why? Yes, sir.
Martyrdom of Thomas of Becket.
Because of St. Thomas. Because of St. Thomas of Becket. And what did St. Thomas do relative to the King Henry II of England?
He stood up against him.
He stood up against him. So probably apocryphal but famous quote that King Henry II said, Who will
rid me of this meddlesome priest?
And he said it exactly like that. Who will rid me of this meddlesome priest? And it might have been from the film version or the stage play version, but it doesn't really matter. That's exactly the sentiment. If, St. Thomas is saying, God before state, Jesus before king, and then the King Henry is saying, wait a minute, I am the boss. Who will rid me of this meddlesome priest? And so here is it's cut off a little bit, St. Thomas reliquary casket. This is in the Ashmolean Museum, but this was actually made in Limoges in France. So you get the sense that the fame and renown of St. Thomas became such that everyone needs to go to Canterbury at some point in your life. Because why? Because St. Thomas was martyred there, was executed there, and it shows the 3 knights, and St. Thomas is bowed down there. He's holding a cross, and he's about to be executed. And so the idea that, let me go back to that one. The idea that you would go to St. Thomas in Canterbury because, for one, it gives you a reason to travel in the spring, and also you'd want to pay homage to the martyr, the person who stood up to the head of state to say that God is more important than the secular rule or secular law. So in my mind, in the history of literature, it's very much in the tradition of Antigone, Sophocles' play Antigone, and also in the tradition of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., in his great speeches about, you pay attention to the law of God being higher than the law of humans, because being fallen creatures and being capable of errors, we will write laws that do not make sense. And so what does it say in the scriptures? What does God say? So you would want to go there, and you would want to be availed of a drop of St. Thomas blood. And there was a sacred vial of St. Thomas blood that you could be anointed with, and it would always replenish itself miraculously. You could always go there, and there was more St. Thomas blood. I'll find out when I go there, because the idea is like, well, you were blessed at Winchester Cathedral, and then by the time you get to Canterbury, where's the blood of St. Thomas? I want to find out, where is that? And so,
Can you bring some back for us?
yeah, but we could all probably benefit from that. In fact, if I bring it back, maybe it continues to replenish and continues to get more and more, just, as supplying a reason for that. So a little bit more background on Chaucer. Why is he the father of English literature, and why did Chesterton write this wonderful book about him? So Chesterton says he's English, he's Catholic, he's chivalric, and he's bourgeois. And in the biography or in history, the reason why is that he spent a considerable amount of time in France and Italy and spoke a bunch of languages, read Virgil, Ovid, Statius, Seneca, Cicero, French, Latin, Anglo-Norman, and Italian. And he was also a military veteran, soldier in the Hundred Years' War. He was taken prisoner, he was a courtier. So I think he had knowledge, access to knowledge that a lot of us did not. And he, speaking European languages and witnessed to the political fallout when England goes to war with France and people go back and forth for years and years. It gave him a lot of material. So, and this is where it gets so good about when Chesterton writes about Chaucer, and when you get the sense for kindred spirits somewhat, because Chesterton says that Chaucer was a great poet in the vein of a Shakespeare. Did Shakespeare sort of supplant or replace Chaucer? I don't think so, but I guess in the 70s, being an English major and going to a somewhat conservative Presbyterian college in Michigan, it was sort of the unwritten idea, and this has changed a lot, I think, in the study of literature. It's become broader and more rich and diverse, but at the time, in the 70s, it was sort of an unwritten idea that if you want to master English literature, all you need is Chaucer, Shakespeare, and Milton. It had to end on Milton, in the severity of Milton's writing, but if you could get as much as you could out of Chaucer and Shakespeare, and then read some Milton, read Paradise Lost, then you've mastered literature. Of course, that's not true. Literature is far bigger and far more diverse than that. But if you remember the Canterbury Tales, in the beginning of it, Chaucer proposes 120 tales because there's 30 pilgrims, and they would tell 2 tales at the beginning on the way to Canterbury and 2 on the way back. So that would multiply, but only finished 24 of them. There are only approximately 24 in the Canterbury Tales. Some of them are really long and some of them are shorter. Some of them are really funny. Some of them are more like a sermon. He's trying different forms of literature. And in this bullet point, it says, boisterous humor, bawdiness, jokes, satire, self-parody led to expurgation. The idea that the version you might read in high school or even in middle school would have some of the bad stuff taken out, or some of the jokes that were a little too racy or a little too offensive. We might call it, sexual harassment today, maybe. I don't know exactly in Chaucer's term, but you take that out if you're reading for younger grades, but then it's back in the college edition. And so I think this is definitely a reason why Chesterton is so good on Chaucer, because he appreciates the size of the kind of writing that he's doing, and he doesn't back away from the puns and the satire, and he enjoys that approach to it. And it's definitely why the Canterbury Tales survive as a text. Because some people say, Chaucer was writing in English. It doesn't look like English to us. It looks like some other language, but he was writing in English, and that was a choice on his part not to write in Latin or French or Italian. That would have been more kind of the literary mainstream. And he's writing in English because he wants to establish what is an English person, what is a Catholic, what is a person of faith, what is a person that's fully alive and fully human in every sense of the word. And so he puts all that stuff into it. And that's why it makes such a great subject. Here are a couple other photos. I'll read you an excerpt here. 2 photos from illuminated manuscripts. One at the Huntington Library in California, the other at the British Library. And so the reason that it survived was just because the Canterbury Tales is just so fully developed and fully of life. It's not cleaned up, or it's not driven by doctrine per se. It's definitely Christian, it's definitely Catholic, it's definitely got the purpose of paying homage to the martyr, but then it has everything else about the nature of human nature in it and how people are flawed individuals, including the members of the church at the time, and for good and for bad and for everything in between. Some people feel that Chaucer is, trying to, I guess, to be, Chesterton has a quote that says, people mistake Chaucer to be like a Lollard. A Lollard was the name of a heresy in the Middle Ages, and people mistake Chaucer to be a morning star of the Reformation, like sort of a predecessor to the Reformation, because he's satirizing members of the clergy, the monk, the friar, the priors, the parson, the summoner, the pardoner. The parson is the only one who's, seems to be, free from sin, morally clean, as far as you can tell. The others are all, but that's what makes them interesting. But so Chesterton takes up the question about was Chaucer a sort of previewing the Reformation, or was Chaucer like an early version of Martin Luther? And the answer is definitely not. Was Chaucer a Lollard is another question that Chesterton takes up. Does anyone remember from church history or theology, what is a Lollard? A funny word. If you were accused of being a Lollard, because Chesterton said he thought the Lollard was the happiest kind of heretic there could be, or the friendliest kind of heretic there could be would be a Lollard. It's something that you probably wouldn't know unless you were studying like church history of the Middle Ages or leading up to the Reformation. Does anybody know what a Lollard is, Ted?
A follower of Wycliffe.
A follower of Wycliffe. And what did Wycliffe do?
Called for reform, rather shrilly, I would say.
Rather shrilly, and more connection to the Anglican tradition, kind of closer to the Reformation. The idea that, well, you translate the Bible into the Vulgate or the native tongue. And so what I read, it said the Lollard was literally, I think it was a Dutch word meaning somebody who mumbles. And you correct me if I'm wrong. Like a Lollard means, so I guess the idea that if you're reading the scriptures in your language, in English, because it's been translated, and then you're mumbling the scriptures out loud, and it's not accomplishing much in that context of the Middle Ages, the Lollard. So anyways, Chesterton on Chaucer, and the winner is going to receive supper if you tell the best story. So there's some competition going on in the Canterbury Tales, and that's why it's funny and humorous to read them. And then, as I said earlier, like the fact that they're going to pay homage to St. Thomas, but there's not much at all of the way of like helpful history. That's why Hilaire Belloc had to write The Old Road, because we know that they were going from London, from the Tabard Inn, but other than that, if you were actually doing the real pilgrimage, which really did become really popular, and still to this day people are doing the pilgrimage by this group of people. Here's a list of not all 30 of them, because some of them have other dependents with them. There are 3 nuns traveling with the prioress and that type of thing. And I put in red some of the more memorable ones, I guess, from you might remember or might not how this works out. But definitely would recommend it to you as a great work of literature, both the Canterbury Tales and Chesterton's book on the Canterbury Tales. So everyone agrees that the Canterbury Tales is one of the seminal texts of Christian poetry and Chaucer's contribution to this great tradition. According to our resident and esteemed scholar Dale Ahlquist, you'll hear from this afternoon. Here's a quote from Dale Ahlquist. The Canterbury Tales are like a cathedral built of words, huge in scope, minute in detail. The poem is perfectly constructed, if ultimately unfinished. To read it is to join on the pilgrimage being described, the journey to a holy place, to partake in both the hard work and all the amusing, even painfully funny events that help us to get there. But as I say, it's an unfinished work, and there is something unfinished about Chesterton's masterpiece also. When I say Chesterton's masterpiece, I refer to the entire body of his work, which lacks the book on Shakespeare that he never wrote. We get a glimpse of what that book would have been here as he compares Chaucer and Shakespeare. It's in the chapters on Chaucer as Englishmen and Chaucer and the Renaissance. He addresses those who have a hard time with Chaucer's Middle English by reminding them that some people even need Shakespeare to be translated. If you read Shakespeare, Shakespeare technically in the history of languages, Shakespeare is called modern English because it begins about the 16th century. Chaucer, Middle English. When you look at Shakespeare, modern English, and how many high school students and us and college students, need Shakespeare to be translated. So even then. So Chesterton says the 4 points, right, about Chaucer. So here's what Chesterton is saying on Shakespeare. That Shakespeare is the English giant, all but alone in his stature among the sons of man, is a truth that does not really diminish with distance, but it is a truth with two aspects, a shield with two sides, a sword with two edges. It is exactly because Shakespeare is an English giant that he blocks up the perspective of English history. He is as disproportionate to his own age as to every age. But he throws a misleading limelight on his own age and throws a gigantic shadow back on the other ages. For this reason, many will not even know what I mean when I talk about the greater spaciousness around the medieval poet. Now he's talking about Chaucer in comparison to Shakespeare. If the matter were pushed to a challenge, however, I would perhaps illustrate my meaning even better with another medieval poet. It is vaguely implied that Shakespeare was always jolly and Dante always gloomy. Joseph Pearce is going to talk about Dante. But in a philosophical sense, it is almost the other way around. It is notably so if, as we speak, we actually bring Shakespeare to the test of Dante. We do not know in our hearts that Shakespeare could have dealt with Dante's hell, but hardly with Dante's heaven. Insofar as it is possible to be greater than anything that is really great, the man who wrote of Romeo and Juliet might have made something even more poignant out of Paolo and Francesca, in a comparison of those two great poets. So that's the end of the quote from Chesterton. Regardless of the difficulty of reading Chaucer's Middle English, scholars regard the Canterbury Tales as the beginning of English literature because Chaucer chose to write it in his native English, as we said. So I'm skipping ahead here. Chesterton asked, why would we look back on Chaucer? Why would we look into the medieval past for wisdom? Why would you say Chaucer is on the same level, if not greater, than Shakespeare? After all, Chaucer lived before the cataclysms that shaped the world we live in, before the Renaissance, before the Reformation, before the Age of Exploration, the French Revolution, the Scientific Revolution, colonialism, world wars, COVID. Chaucer was a long time before COVID. All these things, all these paradigm shifts. So why would we read the Canterbury Tales? Because, for these reasons we've been saying, it's funny, it's boisterous, it's humorous, it's very highly colored. Like you definitely remember these characters. Dale Ahlquist, I'm quoting him one more time. Dale Ahlquist writes that Chesterton has often been dismissed for blindly idealizing the Middle Ages, but the real problem is quite the opposite. Chesterton has been dismissed for idealizing the Middle Ages. The modern world automatically attacks the Middle Ages as something backwards, dark, and superstitious, the enemy of reason and liberty. Because Chaucer in the Middle Ages lived long before all these things we've gone through. Chesterton merely defended the truth that reason and liberty enjoyed a high point in medieval times, and that the world hasn't seen since. History is not a story of progress. Our fortunes move both backward and forward, just like the Pilgrim's Way. While technology provides a kind of liberty, it also provides a kind of slavery. While the experts are useful as servants, they are unbearable as masters. In the Middle Ages, the peasant class, according to Chesterton, was still successfully fighting off the rise of the aristocratic state. He refers to a famous peasant uprising where they had, quote, killed the lawyers, a comprehensible and relatively even commendable course. Chesterton's great for quotes. They also showed some disposition to hang anybody who could read or write, which is perhaps carrying the distrust of professionalism too far. Don't trust people who can read or write. The most difficult thing for us to understand about that culture is that it was purely Catholic. There were no reformers or rebels to contend with. The theology was solid and widespread. The criticisms of the church came in the form of making fun of stuffy Roman officialism, or in the case of Geoffrey Chaucer, making fun of friars. Now it leads me to a few more slides here. The ones in red here, I've just kind of highlighted a few characteristics, and I'm looking at the clock here. I've got maybe about 10 minutes, but talking about these, if you go back to read the Canterbury Tales, which I'd recommend you to do, and to read Chesterton's book, you'll get this information from them. And as I started to reread it over the summer and think about, I read it in high school in the 70s, I reread it again in college. I actually had it 2 semesters, I think. One as an undergraduate, where we had to read it tortured to read us in Middle English, and then I had to take a semester of Anglo-Saxon in graduate school. So that was part of the course of study. But I still remember from back in high school these 5. The miller, for example, he's playing bagpipes and he's leading the procession. In that earlier, this mural by Ezra Winter from the Library of Congress, see if I get this pointer here, that's the miller. He's on a horse. Now this is, again, sort of an artist reinterpretation. Chaucer doesn't say this, but the artist, Ezra Winter, puts the miller at the very head of the procession. And, the fact that he's satirizing these people and not satirizing the class of people, or he's not attacking the institution of the church. The miller's not connected to the church, but he's just a real flesh and blood person. That if you met him, you would remember him, because you don't make this stuff up. Well, you do make it up if you're a great creative writer, but meaning that it's so distinct and so clear, it's not boilerplate, it's not generic. Like, this guy really existed at some point in time, if only in Chaucer's imagination, or probably really was a real person. But he's a brawny chap of 16 stone, about a little over 200 pounds. And remembering how big people were in the Middle Ages, that's a huge person in the Middle Ages. He wears this stuff, physical characteristics. He's got a wart on his nose with hair. Reed is the bristles of a sow's ear. So you can tell what that means even in the Middle English. The fact that he would point out the color of hair on the wart on his nose, that was a distinguishing characteristic. In the Middle Ages, I think there's an assumption that your physical form mirrors your spiritual form. If you're physically ugly, you must be spiritually fallen, or you must be corrupt individual. So that sort of stereotype. And he's got black nostrils and a mouth like a furnace door, and he plays the bagpipes, and he's boastful, he tells dirty jokes, and the miller's tale is one that's usually taken out, or very much shortened in the high school or the middle school version. He's greedy and dishonest, he cheats people with his thumb on the scale, bawdy and belligerent. He's compared to a sow or a fox in Chaucer's version of it. Chesterton writes about all of this. And the thing I like about Chesterton's book is he doesn't really dwell on the particulars. Like, he takes a very broad brush and kind of says, don't say that Chaucer was attacking the church or attacking Catholicism. He wasn't. He was a Catholic himself, and he was looking at people he was with in his society, and they're real people, even if they're a prioress or a nun that rides side saddle. And I like this character too, just because she seems very worldly, of the world, but in service to the church, in service to God through Christ. And she's of the Benedictine order. She rides side saddle. Some of these pictures are from illuminated manuscripts, and some of them are modern pictures. So this one's from the illuminated manuscript. She's got a coral rosary on her wrist and a golden brooch, and it's ascribed with Amor vincit omnia, which I think means love conquers all. So it could be somewhat ambiguous. Is it God's love for the world, or is it some other form of love? Knowing Chaucer, it might be all of the above. And the fact that she seems to be very, cultivated, or high society, speaking French in a Parisian style, and she keeps dogs and cares deeply about animals. Chesterton's got a great line about this. The fact that her dogs are so important to her is really distinctly English. Like, there's something about dogs, and the British people, maybe Joseph can say about this, and gardens too, like sort of cloistered gardens and dogs, and sort of the obsession over the propriety of that. So the prioress very much like that. She's dainty, well-bred. She doesn't let crumbs fall from her lips. And I don't have it on the slide, but oh yeah, the fact that she doesn't like seeing a mouse in a trap. She will cry if she sees a mouse in a trap. So it doesn't seem like her first priority is devotion to the church, but she's a real person. She's the thing that makes you read the book, and the thing that keeps it on high school reading lists is because it's got all the real stuff in it. And another famous one of my favorite suits, called The Wife of Bath. And Chaucer's making a joke just in the title that we know that the prioress is called Madame Eglantine. She has a real name, even though she might not be a real person. The Wife of Bath doesn't have a name per se, except the Wife of Bath. It's kind of a joke or a pun that she was married so many times that she could be married to the whole town of Bath, or Bath. And I think in England they would say Bath, and we say Bath. So she's the wife of literally all of the men of Bath, but not quite. She has expensive clothes and nice, accoutrement. She's famous for having gap teeth. In the Middle Ages, that's known as being amorous. If you see somebody with gap teeth, like who's the famous NFL player? Like, is it Michael Strahan?
Yes.
Michael Strahan. So he must be an amorous person. He's always falling in love, according to medieval theology. And that's the wife of Bath. So she's pretty. She's had 5 husbands in addition to other. Chaucer kind of makes this allusion to, well, she probably had a few youthful dalliances. So, she has all of those. She's unusually, for her time, she's been to Jerusalem 3 times, Rome and Bologna. She's been to St. James, the Camino de Compostela, and in Germany and Cologne. So a really unique and distinctive person. Here's another one. Is it a satire of the institution or of the church itself? No, it's not a satire. It's just fun and funny to read, and it's an interesting person. This is a modern illustration of the monk that has his sleeves with fur, and he's got a golden pin tied in a lover's knot. And he also likes the physical luxuries of the world, like the Wife of Bath and like the prioress. He's got nice boots. He's got bells. He likes horses. He's got a bald, greasy face and fat, bulging eyeballs. And so, he's got dogs, horses. He's lives in a monastery entirely, but he doesn't find himself devoted to that completely. I'm almost at the end here. The summoner is one that is frequently pointed out to being like, pre-Reformation, the church was doing all this bad stuff, like you had the pardoner and the summoner, the selling of indulgences, all that stuff that leads up to Luther. So the summoner is described as, in this way, like physically ugly, with boils and pimples, narrow eyes, a garland on his head. The idea that taverns and pubs would use a garland as a sign, like if they didn't have any writing on the wall, there would be a garland. It's like, that's where we can go get a pint. That's where we can get a drink because it's got a garland. So he would wear that. He likes to get drunk. He likes garlic, onion, and leeks. And children are afraid of him, and he knows everybody's business because he's sort of a gossiper, I guess. And the fact that he's called a summoner because if you were accused of something in the church, the court of the church, he would summon you to go to appear, but you could get out of it by giving him money. It would sort of buy your time until you're called again to appear before the church council or the consistory, the priest, whatever it is. He doesn't know much Latin. And then here's the last slide. So thinking back onto the beginning again of like Chaucer being a great writer, being a great poet, a great Catholic poet in the Christian tradition, whom Chesterton writes about so well. And I quoted very little from my 20-page paper, but I'll send it to you as an email if anybody wants to send me an email if you'd like to read it. And then the fact that it's tied in with my connection to G.K. Chesterton through C.S. Lewis and through the great writers of the Inklings and all the ones we've mentioned so far, including T.S. Eliot, and going on sabbatical next semester, being blessed with a semester off from teaching by my university, and they're willing to give me time and space to go to, this is a historical picture of the Tabard Inn that was rebuilt by the Talbot, called the Talbot, but it's gone now, and I'm not going to go there, but we're going to go to Oxford first and then Winchester to walk the Canterbury pilgrimage, the Pilgrim's Way to Canterbury Cathedral in the month that Chaucer recommended it. So that is how I got on this topic for today, and I probably talked a little bit too long and a little bit extemporaneously, but I really appreciate your time and attention and your indulgence, and thank you so much for coming to this conference, and thank you for listening.